Okay, let's go ahead and get started, Janet. Hello and welcome. Day 3 of the Connection Conference is out on the launch pad. We're excited for a full slate of engaging sessions. Today, we have great partners that are speaking, including this session. Later today, it includes Snapchat, CASE, Campus ESP, and so much more. My name is Adam Parker here with Carnegie. For this final session, we are joined by Janet Marling, the Executive Director. Everybody can hear my audio. Okay. Make sure you join your audio in the lower left-hand corner. The Executive Director of the National Institute for the Study of Transfer Students. She will be helping us create meaningful connections for transfer students. Before we get started, I want to share a few quick reminders. This session is being recorded. Additionally, I encourage you to be social. Please direct all questions and conversations through the Whova chat and Q&A functionality on the right-hand side of the screen. There we go. We'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout. Time permitting, we'll cover as many questions as we can at the end. Obviously, we have limited time here, so if any questions or comments arise in this session, please reach out to marketing@carnegiehighered.com or take Carnegie HQ on social. With that, I'm excited to pass this session over to Janet to dive in.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Adam. I really appreciate both you and Travis being behind the scenes to help keep things moving along today. Welcome, everybody. I am excited to know that there are so many of you interested this morning in talking about transfer students and meaningfully engaging these students. We know that in today's climate, with declining enrollment, a lot of institutions are looking to transfer students to maybe fill seats and maybe bring the budget back to where it needs to be. And we know that while that is well-intentioned, we also want to make sure that on the backside, we have the infrastructure in place to really make sure that these students are moving in the direction that they are intending to move. So we're going to spend some time today talking specifically about creating those meaningful transfer connections. And that word meaningful is really important to me because without intention, meaning doesn't happen, but being intentional doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be a meaningful connection for our transfer students. So we're going to get into this a little bit deeper as we go through. The webinar format is a little bit limiting in the sense that I can't see you, but you can see me. Adam's going to be monitoring our chat and being able to kind of collect some of the Q&A. But we're going to make this as interactive as possible. And by that, I mean, I do want you all engaging in the chat. I most definitely want you to be thinking about a little bit later on in our presentation, we're going to do some workshopping in the sense that we've got a Google Doc that you're going to go ahead and start filling out. Because bottom line, it doesn't help if I spend all of our time together talking at you, but you're not having time to reflect and you're not thinking about what it is that we're talking about today. So just know that you're going to need something to write with, something to write on, whether that's physical or whether you're somebody that likes to take notes on your computer. Just know that that is an important part of today's presentation. So while we know that there are a lot of different success metrics out there for transfer students, today we're really going to be focusing on creating those conditions that allow transfer students to thrive. And by that, we mean, and I particularly mean, putting information in their hands, connecting them to resources that will help them be engaged learners and make it to their end goal. And when I say an engaged learner, it means that we're separating out all of those things that they would typically be worrying about. Like, what is the process for getting into my next school? How am I going to pay for my next school? What am I thinking about related to communicating with my next school? How can I get all of the paperwork done and in? Will I find a community at my next school? All of those things that might mean matriculating, being invested and getting acclimated to the institution, and then moving through their studies. So we're trying to erase a lot of the ambiguity that our transfer students face whenever they're moving in between institutions. So we're going to spend some time thinking about that. So whenever I say what conditions are we trying to create, we're creating where transfer students have the knowledge necessary to access the resources that allows them then to be the architects of their own academic journey. And that's really important because as institutions, we see ourselves as that destination. We're the folks who are going to help students, but really and truly, we need to flip that a little bit and think about the student at the center of this journey. And we are but a destination. We are not the destination, especially for transfer students. When you think of the large transfer ecosystem, it includes sending institutions, it includes receiving institutions, and most importantly, it's that student right in between those two. So when we're talking about creating those conditions, it really does mean that we're trying to help those students be the architects, make the choices, and not be beholden to the way that we think things need to happen on their behalf. So when we think about that, they're going to be those architects of their educational journey so that they may engage in learning that allows them to get that business out of the way of how to get into college, that particular college, navigating a new system, and finding a sense of belonging. That's what we're trying to talk about today. So in creating those conditions, like I mentioned before, doesn't happen by accident. We have to be very intentional for transfer students because their success cannot be left to chance. The stakes are really high for transfer students. They have college under their belt. They have time invested. They have money invested. Maybe it's recently, maybe there's been a gap in their enrollment, but either way, they are proven college students. They have done the work. However, we can't make any assumptions because they haven't necessarily done college at our institution. So it's really important that we, when we're thinking about who's responsible for this transfer student success, that we don't get bogged down in the, well, it all should have happened at the sending institution, or wait a minute, the receiving institution should have been communicating better, when in reality, it's the responsibility of all of us across institutions and within institutions. And the danger of this becomes the fact that when everybody's responsible, nobody is responsible. So we are really going to be spending our time today thinking about the people, not necessarily the services or the programs, but rather how each of us as individuals and how us collectively in departments or maybe divisions can take the responsibility for erasing some of the barriers that transfer students are facing, creating those meaningful connections to get them to the next point in their journeys, and how all of that plays together in the larger transfer ecosystem. So that's what we're going to spend our time doing today. So when we think about the transfer ecosystem and the transfer student journey, I'd like to start thinking about this transfer journey through the eyes of two of our most recent transfer student ambassadors. First of all, allow me to introduce you to Ashton Husband. And I want to tell you a little bit about him. It's going to take a minute just to kind of read this, but I want, as I'm telling you a little bit about Ashton, I want you to think about what that journey may have been like, not just from a physical perspective, but maybe some of the anxieties that Ashton may have experienced. I want you to think about some of the touch points at his various institutions, and just think about maybe what his transfer journey must have been like, and where maybe had he been a student leaving or coming into your institution, that might be something that you would have been engaged with. So here we go. So Ashton hoped to play football for a university and then for the NFL. He entered the football team at Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College as a walk-on, and then his story took an unexpected turn, much like it did with so many other students when the COVID pandemic hit. It changed the trajectory of his life. And as a non-scholarship athlete, Ashton was eventually cut from the community college team and began to explore his opportunities for four-year universities. He chose the University of Southern Mississippi due to its criminal justice program. Once again, however, he was unable to play football when a new coaching staff was hired. Ashton says, quote, "I needed to pivot and find ways to make an impact on this campus. Just because football ended did not mean that my life or school was over," end quote. He decided to dive into campus involvement, becoming a leader in various organizations like Men of Excellence and the Transfer Student Association. His favorite service opportunities include being a mentor for transfer students and for minority freshmen. He says, although your time is short wherever you may transfer to, you can still make a difference. You can still leave behind a legacy worth remembering. Ashton is certainly creating a memorable legacy at the University of Southern Mississippi and is excited to add the role of National Transfer Student Ambassador in helping students learn how to better serve, or learning how to better serve students just like him. So in thinking about that transfer journey, it's really important to, again, consider all aspects of maybe what the students are going through. So that's Ashton's story. I want to introduce you to one more of our wonderful transfer student ambassadors. This is Crystal Ramos. Crystal started her college education 20 years ago, but left school when she got married and became a mother. After several years of work in the corporate world, she felt dissatisfied. It was time to go back to college, and Crystal was accepted to Texas A&M University, San Antonio, where her feeling of unrest continued. As an older student, she struggled to make connections on campus. Undaunted, she kept going to events and found an on-campus job as a transfer retention student coordinator. This job helped her realize how many resources were available for students just like her. And then she says, I did not have it all together, but the home I found on the campus and in the student engagement office empowered me to feel like it was possible. Ever since then, I knew I had to help others experience the same sense of empowerment. And that is exactly what Crystal did. Knowing that transfer students can be any age and of any background, she wants to be sure that they have smoother transitions to their new schools. Her goal as a National Student Ambassador is to guarantee that students don't have to go searching for help, but rather have the resources find them before they even realize they needed them. Now, I don't know about you all, but that makes my heart sing. These are two of our 4 transfer student ambassadors who were selected through a national application process. And these individuals will be representing transfer students across the nation at our annual conference in February. But I want to begin to really think about their experiences through what we consider to be the transfer life cycle. So as we talk about what that transfer journey could look like, I won't use the word typically looks like, because there is nothing typical about a transfer student. They do things their own way. They're all very different and they have different intended outcomes. But when we think about a journey that they might be going through, let's talk for just a little bit about this transfer life cycle. So in this first phase, we look at preparation. And that's just where the student's mind is going, whether they are currently in an institution and are knowing that they are considering a transfer, we call those planned transfers, or if by chance they are in a situation where they are needing to transfer and it was unplanned, much like what you saw with Ashton. He wasn't planning to transfer. COVID kind of exacerbated things just a little bit for him. So these are all the thoughts and things that go into pre-transfer activities. All right, and then when we think about the second part or phase of this transfer journey, we really think about enrollment. And this is all the stuff that you have to do to get into college. So this could include admissions, it could include filling out your financial aid information. This could be making appointments with academic departments, thinking about, if you're fortunate enough to, which you should be, providing an articulation of a transcript before a student enters the institution. These are your orientation activities. So all of those enrollment type activities. And if you think about it, preparation and enrollment are kind of the things that we know the most about. This is, a lot of us have jobs in these areas. We kind of know what it looks like on a website to be thinking about sharing information with students, et cetera. So those are the two that kind of tend to come to mind when you say the word transfer, because sometimes transfer feels like it's that transactional moving of person or credit, but in reality, it's more of an actual life cycle. So the third phase in this life cycle is really looking at it from the standpoint of acclimation. And this is getting used to your new environment. Now, this may have been something that was done through an orientation program, like I mentioned, as part of the enrollment, but really it's getting your feet into what's new. Now, this campus could be in person, it could be virtual, but what it means is translating what you knew from your past institution into what you know now, and trying to figure out the ins and outs. And this is where things get a little tricky, because we want to give college students who have been engaged in higher education all the kudos in the world for already having done college. At the same time, it's really important that we don't make any assumptions that they know how to navigate the here and now at their new institution. So that's where that acclimation piece is really important, and we have to ask really good questions so that we can find out where they are, what they know, and what they don't know. The fourth kind of phase is the notion around engagement. And we know from all the research that when students are feeling engaged, they have a tendency to make better progress towards their intended outcomes. And so therefore, looking for ways to, we always think when we talk about new from high school students, engaging in campus culture and campus community, joining organizations and clubs, getting involved in your residence hall. If you're an online student, looking for ways to get involved with different online opportunities. Well, in this case, our transfer students oftentimes don't have the opportunity, the time, the interest in maybe being a involved student in the way that we might be thinking about it. But there is a common denominator for everyone's engagement when they're a transfer student, and that's the classroom. And that's where we have to get really creative about thinking, how can we help students be engaged with our curricular information, but also within their potential chosen career paths, or in opportunities to do some service-based learning, those types of things that can help students, again, move forward into their areas of interest. And then finally, we get to that word completion. Transfer students are engaged in higher education for a variety of reasons. Not all of them are seeking a bachelor's degree. Not all of them are seeking a credential that would provide them anything more than improved learning in their field. So there are a lot of variations on that theme as to what completion looks like. But once you're thinking about what happens after that, we're looking at graduate school, we're looking at work opportunities, etc. So that's kind of the framework that we're looking at from the perspective of this phase. But as we know, each phase in the life cycle they're not necessarily linear. Whenever you're looking at this, you might have a student that does a little bit of preparation and then finds a way to kind of take a break for a little bit. They might get accepted and have done all the enrollment pieces. Maybe they've even started engaging and they've had to take some time out and maybe recuperate from an illness. Or they may be in a situation where they're being asked to come home to help out with family. So there might be a stop out in there. It's just really important that we aren't necessarily looking at this life cycle from a specific linear perspective. But the reason I'm showing it to you is I really want you to think about both Ashton and also Crystal's perspectives around where they might have had their biggest challenges. You think about whenever you saw Ashton, he was expecting to play football. His engagement was on the field. Even though he wasn't recruited, he was still engaged in the program. When that went away, he had to kind of figure out what was next. He had to go back through that planning process and really thinking about the preparation and what that would look like. And when you think about Crystal from the standpoint of having to stop out completely, when she was coming back as an adult learner, really thinking through what her goals wanted to be, it was a little intimidating. So that whole notion of going through the plan or the preparation and the actual pieces of getting into school were probably the easiest pieces, but that acclimation and that engagement were really difficult. She said flat out, I didn't feel like I had it together, but she was able to find her home. So when we're thinking about that transfer life cycle and where we can be most helpful, I really want to stress that at any given time, based on these phases, I'm curious to know from your perspective, where you see, and this is where this is going to be our first opportunity. So let me just tell you right now, go grab something to write on and write with. And then we're going to ask you all, we're going to come back to this life cycle. And I want you to think for just a second. And it's really important that when I talk about the life cycle and you're thinking about the types of work that you do, I'm not making any assumptions that you are working in person with a transfer student. Many of you in this workshop may very well have that wonderful opportunity to influence students in person. And when I say in person, I mean with another person, knowing that it's a live type of exchange. Many of you may be those important people behind the scenes who are creating information sources, whether it's a web page, whether it is a social media post. You may be the individuals who are in the marketing department really thinking through how we explain what the transfer student journey looks like at our institution. You may be an administrator who is putting policies in place, or you may be somebody who's figuring out a procedure that makes sense for a transfer student as opposed to somebody who is coming directly from high school. So when I ask this next question of you, I am very well aware that it will be different for all of us based upon the particular area that we are working in. So my question for you is, where do you see your work intersecting with some of these phases? So just take a minute to write down, like, this aspect of my work would likely fall into the student transfer journey in this phase. Just take a minute to kind of make some notes. It could be in one, heavily weighted in one particular area, or you might find yourself dabbling in a couple of different phases. So take a minute to start centering yourself in the transfer student life cycle. And as you're thinking through these things, I want to make a couple of points. Each phase in the life cycle is an opportunity for us as individuals and institutions to interact. And again, I use that word interact because it may not be face-to-face, virtually, or in person. It may be interacting with them passively because they're reviewing your literature, your content, or they're abiding by your policies and processes. So we have that opportunity to interact with these students through direct contact or through those mechanisms that I just described. NISTS firmly believes that every interaction, anytime, whether it's in person or through these mechanisms, we can either propel these students toward their desired outcome, we can maintain the status quo, or we could potentially derail their progress. And that's why it's so important when we talk about creating meaningful connections with students, is that we're really thoughtful. Because think about a student who is bringing credits into an institution and gets notification that the majority of their credits will not transfer because they took an applied business degree at the community college and are now applying to a university business school. That student had no idea that they were an applied program. Imagine what that feels like. When that news comes without the proper structure around helping that student figure out a plan B, that student's dream is derailed. And this was an actual incident, and that student had the opportunity to change a major, reconfigure their schedule, only lose but about a semester, and was able to graduate with a bachelor's degree. But it took some soul searching right there in the beginning. So all of us as individuals and the institution have that opportunity to either propel students forward, maintain that status quo, or potentially derail students in the process. So again, thinking through just quickly, based on these different phases, where is your work likely to intersect with those students? So one thing, and I'm going to tell you a story about my friend Avalie here in just a second, is one thing that I want you all to think about as well is that when students, they're engaged in this life cycle, they look at our institution as a whole. They may reach out to admissions, they may talk to financial aid, they may talk to their academic department, they may talk to orientation, but they have the expectation that we're all talking to one another. And you and I know that universities have silos, and that sometimes we're really good at helping students with our sphere of responsibility, but we may not know as much about what's going on in somebody else's sphere. I kind of liken it to us going to the grocery store. You and I go to the grocery store, and I don't mean a market, I mean like a supermarket, if you will. And there are different departments in the supermarket. You've got your deli, you've got your bakery, you've got your meats, you've got your produce. You shop in each one of those departments, and you might interact with a team member because you are looking for a particular item, or maybe there's a price match issue. But all in all, when you go to pay, you are paying overall, and you're having an experience at that particular supermarket. Unlike if you were going to, say, a farmer's market where you might pay each individual vendor. Students don't see us as each individual vendors, but we often see our departments as individual vendors, if you will, based on the services that we provide our students. And that's where we get tripped up, because students need to see that big picture. They need to know, and they need an advocate. So speaking of advocates, this is Avalie. She was a returning adult student. She started her career in healthcare at a private institution, a proprietary institution that communicated to her that she would have an absolutely fantastic salary when she finished, and that this was the place for her to go. It was convenient, it was online, it was what she thought she needed to do. Until she hit that one class that she simply could not pass. And everything she conceptualized about her college degree was on the line. It was absolutely just vanishing. So she took some time out. She took a semester off to really collect herself and understand what her options were. She found herself on campus, actually here at the University of North Georgia on our Gainesville campus. And she went into the advising office unannounced. Pretty seemingly the right thing to do. If you're a student, you want to know about your credits, you show up. At some institutions, maybe she would not have been granted an opportunity to meet without an appointment. Many institutions have that opportunity for walk-ins. And for her case, in her case, it was a wonderful opportunity. She was able to sit down with somebody who spent significant time asking her what she wanted to do. And advisors are equipped to do this, but we can all do this. What do you want to do? What do you see as your future? Where are you headed? What worked in the past? What didn't work in the past? What time horizon are you working on? Those are important things to know so that you can put in context when students are coming to you asking questions. So in Avalie's case, she had a wonderful hour-and-a-half conversation with this advisor. That is a luxury, my friends, in these days. An hour-and-a-half later, she realized that she loved communication. And she switched her major from healthcare to communications, understanding that there would be some credits that would not transfer into that new discipline. And it turned out that she was so happy and was so successful that she was able to zip through the rest of her classes. So it's just an example of how when you have a student with you, you can't just take them at their word for what is going on. She needed to find a new major. We need to get into the weeds just a little bit more. So let's talk a little bit about that. So when I say meaningfully connecting with students, there's something pretty specific that I'm talking about here. And with that, number one, it's helping students Envision their entire transfer student journey, not just the thing they're there to tell you about, but that entire journey, where they've come from, where they're headed, and all the in between. And then helping them to understand that that journey is more than just checking the boxes on your transfer to-do list, but rather it's seeing not just what's next, but what's next, and what's next, so that they aren't living checkbox to checkbox to checkbox. Because when you make referrals based on checkboxes, the students aren't that architect that we said, because they don't have the roadmap. They don't have a bigger picture of what they are trying to pursue. They just know the next thing to do. And granted, sometimes that's all the capacity we have, is to manage those next things that we have to do. But in being a meaningful connector, it means taking time to really think through and help those students connect to their entire journey. What it also means is facilitating connections within and maybe even beyond an institution. If you're trying to help somebody transfer to an institution, you may be having conversations across institutions. If you've got somebody within your institution, a new student, you want to think about how they need to be connected across the institution and potentially outside of the institution. If you know of internship opportunities for them, if you know of community-based organizations that they might want to be a part of, or they might be able to receive funding from, those are things, whenever we think about making those connections and figuring out those resources that are meant to ease that transition for that student. And then finally, it means using a culturally relevant practice or practices to really alleviate transfer shock. And transfer shock is typically defined as a dip in GPA after that first semester, but it can also be the shock of entering into a new environment and a new culture and learning a new way of being. So easing that transfer shock and then promoting engagement into the institution. So whenever we talk about that, that's what connectors do. That's a little different than what we would say somebody just sharing their knowledge of the institution and saying, yes, you need to go visit with somebody in financial aid. This is making a dedicated, intentional conversation to find out exactly what a student is looking for before you're sending them forward. So that brings us to kind of that next thing. So this was like what it means to meaningfully connect, and this is what it requires. First of all, it requires knowledge of the student situation. And that can be really difficult to ascertain, because a lot of times we think, I don't have an audience with that initial student. And you may not. You may be reliant on information via avatars that you created or personas that you have created for your students based on your individual student data. You may be reliant upon data that has come through a focus group with former students, former transfers, students who have left your institution and gone somewhere else, students who have come into your institution. But figuring out what that student's situation is and what their needs are is really important. And one of the ways that's really important to do that, as we were mentioning a little bit earlier, is taking the time to ask the right questions. And by that, I mean that you can never assume that whether it's in an email, whether it's in person, whether it's in passing in class, that what a student is asking of you is exactly what they mean to be asking of you. And it may mean that they can't say it in the words that you're used to hearing. So if you're somebody receiving an inquiry from somebody, I really encourage you to clarify with that person exactly what they meant. Because you and I are so quick to be helpful that words come out of our mouth or out of our fingers that want to solve a problem that we haven't necessarily verified. So it's very important that we are getting clarification about what that student is asking for before we ever start creating a plan on how to get them to that next destination. It's also important for you to add additional questions like, what do you plan to do with this information? That will help you to know if they are even asking the right question, because sometimes they aren't. And they may be asking a question that is framed from their former institution that makes absolutely no sense at your institution, but could very easily if you would take the time to ask some of those probing questions. Now, we all know that that word why is difficult to ask in a interpersonal conversation because it can make a student defensive. So we don't want to do that, but we can say, tell me a little bit more about that. I'd love to hear more about your experience with XYZ. Where do you see yourself going with that? Or by the end of the registration period, what do you want to be able to do? So those types of questions I think are super important. So not only do you need to have knowledge of the student situation and needs, but you need to have knowledge of all the facets of transfer ecosystem at your institution and potentially the institution you're sending somebody to, and being personally connected, because it is super difficult to be a connector and to meaningfully connect students if you haven't done the homework yourself at your institution to make that happen. And that can be tricky because we are all super busy. It is so easy to put your head down now that you've got extra duties added, now that things feel like they're still unsettled. It's just super important for you to be thinking more broadly and really starting to ask yourself, what is my current sphere? Like, if I really wanted to be helpful to a student, where not only are my responsibilities lying, but also where do I find myself interacting with folks? And that you'll probably have a nuclear sphere, and then you probably have some concentric rings that are going out, and you know people who know people who know people. Your job is to get to know all of those people, because students are going to come to you with a lot of questions. Now, it is okay whenever you're trying to meaningfully hand somebody off or find a way for them to be connected, for you to say, you know what, I am not the best person to answer that question. However, my friend Miguel over here has a lot of experience with that. Let me make an introduction between the two of you. Please do not send this student randomly to another human being with just a phone number and email address or a Zoom room, because that is intimidating and that is not necessarily a good way for that communication to continue. So if you think about it, the two things that you've got to know: what's going on with that student, or if you're in a different situation, kind of your groups of students. And then who do you need to know? What does your connection circle look like? And how can you potentially beef that up a little bit? All right, so I would like for you all to take a minute, and Adam, if you can go ahead and put this link in the chat. What you have here is a Google Doc. It's very simple. It is just something, in the session description, we talked about creating a protocol for you to start thinking about connecting meaningfully with students. Please, whenever you open this document, you all know the drill, make a copy for yourself. Otherwise, anything you put on here is going to be shared publicly. You should all have all kinds of editing rights. Anybody with the link should be able to connect with this. And in that, you're kind of walked through just an opportunity to think about, first of all, why it's important, period, at all, to connect meaningfully with students. And what do you hope the intended outcomes will be? So those are the two first things that you have to explore just a little bit. Like, why the heck is this important? Is it important because your job demands it? Is it important because that's where your heart is? Is it a little bit of both? And do you need to find some other motivations? Then you need to ask yourself really, truly, what do I want my outcomes to be and what's realistic? Because fitting new knowledge, fitting new processes, fitting new habits into your life right now may not be an easy thing to do. So you need to be really smart about what you're expecting from yourself. So as you're completing this Google Doc, we are not searching for pie in the sky. These are questions to get yourself thinking about why I'm doing this, what I want the intended outcomes to be. And then we're going to do the next thing on that Google Sheet is just an opportunity to go back and kind of recap what we talked about related to this life cycle, and where do your scope of work, where might that intersect with various points on that transfer student life cycle in those phases, and what might that look like? And then the next thing that I'm asking you to do is really think about then building that knowledge base and preparing yourself to actually go through and make those transfer connections for your students and create those handoffs and create that feeling that this person has somewhere to go and feel like they're being shepherded through this. So in that, it's first and foremost getting down on paper all the transfer related places and services and policies and things that touch transfer, kind of seeing it all in one place, doing a little quick audit, not how good they are, not what you know about them, but just what's out there. So if a transfer student came to you and said, I need help with XYZ, could you even potentially point them in a direction based on your knowledge? So then you think about, okay, what's out there? What do I still need to know? Like if I'm looking at the life cycle, and in that life cycle, there are parts of it that I never touch. Say I'm heavy in the enrollment phase, but I probably don't have as much influence in the acclimation phase. But if I want to be a good connector, it's really important that I'm thinking holistically on behalf of that student. So what do I need to know about engagement opportunities for them so that we can talk about that in the context of the question that I might get, or in the context of how I write copy for the website, in the context of how I might encourage others to do their work. So identifying all the transfer pieces, having an opportunity to really think through what else might you need to know. And then the third part of that knowledge base building is, who are your allies in this? Who do you know out there who knows more than you do? And I know there are tons of people. I'm learning from folks all the time, but identifying those people that might be your eventual referral sources, or that might just be able to, you see something on your website that you know nothing about. I didn't know that we had a transfer coaching program. What in the heck do the transfer coaches do? I need to reach out to Allison so that she can tell me a little bit about how she trains her folks and what they're intended to do. So that's the piece that, again, the what's out there, the what do I still need to know, and then the who am I thinking about. And then finally, just really looking down at, what's next. Like, what does this mean? What can I commit to? What is realistic for me in thinking about going through this process? And so in a longer session, when we have lots of time together, I would give you time to go ahead and start filling these out. Hopefully, as I've been talking, you guys have been already making some notes and thinking through what you might want to respond to on here. Again, we're not looking for perfection. What I do want you to be thinking, though, is at the end of it, like, what was easy about completing this form? And where were there some challenges? Like, gosh, that didn't feel comfortable. Like, I don't know if I'd be helpful in this realm. I think it's really important as we ask ourselves to learn something new or take in new information, that we're really responsive to ourselves in knowing that we're either setting realistic expectations for change, or maybe we're not. So in thinking about, as you're filling this out now or later, where are those points where you're just really struggling to either come up with information or come up with ways that you might interact with students? And set those aside as like, these are my growth points. These are areas that I really feel like I need to explore a little bit more. And I think that those are important, because there are people around you who are probably pretty good at the things that you feel kind of awkward about, who could be helpful to you. But please don't take this on like so many of us do. I'm an advocate. I'm a connector. I'm going to make these meaningful connections for our transfer students. I'm going to think about their experience from a holistic perspective. And then you find yourself not doing anything because it feels super overwhelming. So the last thing on there is just like, in the next 2 or 3 weeks, name 1 to 3 things that you might consider doing as part of your journey towards becoming more focused on creating those really meaningful connections for students. So at this time, I know Adam has been looking at the chat, and I know that he's been kind of fielding some questions, and I would love the opportunity to respond to any of those at this point.
Appreciate the engaging session, Janet, and sharing these resources. I do encourage any of our guests that have additional questions, throw those in the Q&A so we can explain those further. I do know many of our audience members are probably earlier in their career. I guess we have quite a wide range in our audience, but you talked about the transfer student kind of life cycle and what area they're focused in. And you also talked a little bit about kind of breaking silos across campus. Knowing some of our audience members are earlier in their career, do you have any tips or maybe best practices where they could help facilitate breaking down some of those silos to ensure an easier transfer student journey?
One of my favorite groups to work with are new professionals, and kind of mid-career professionals, kind of moving into that area, because I think new transfer professionals often feel like they're drinking out of a fire hose, and then they really question their sphere of influence. And I'm here to let each and every one of you know that you have an amazing voice in what you're doing. And I say that because oftentimes on campuses, there are very few people dedicated to working with transfer. And when they are, oftentimes they're wearing multiple hats. So you may find yourself not only a new professional, but a new transfer professional, really advocating in a space that's a little bit lonely, that you find yourself like, okay, I'm having to sing my song louder and louder and louder, but it's being drowned out by all these traditional ways of looking at what we do. So I encourage you to get really good at one aspect of your job related to transfer. And what I mean by that is just pick something that is really important to you. So maybe you're an admission counselor and you want to better understand why students transfer. So talk to people at your institution to find out why people transfer. Do we know that? Does your institutional research department have an idea? Have we ever asked that question of our students? Has student affairs had focus groups with students? But get really good at answering that question so that you can then share that piece of information with the rest of your team. And by doing that, you're already breaking down silos because you're having to ask for that information from other departments. You're getting comfortable with relationships in other departments. And then you can take that knowledge back. Don't feel like you have to be the spokesperson for the entire transfer profession when you're a new professional, but find that one area that you want to get really good at, that question that you're super curious to answer, and then be loud and proud about sharing what you've learned. And that will start to build your confidence. That'll start to build your credibility. And then also strengthen those relationships across campus. So that's just one way to start.
Yeah, sincerely appreciate that insight and appreciate this great conversation and engagement with the audience. I know everyone here wants to support all students throughout their entire life cycle. So as we depart today, I guess, are there any final comments or departing words that you have for our audience, Janet?
Two things. If you are looking for information around transfer, just kind of trying to get your feet wet, or maybe you've been around this for a while and you're just looking for more information, please visit our website. And it's just www.nists.edu. And in there is a knowledge center. That knowledge center has guides, how-to guides. The how-to guides are focused, one in particular, on how to create outstanding transfer-focused websites. It is an 80-page document, but the coolest part is there's a nice short 3-page audit that you can use related to what does your website look like and how can it better serve transfer students. There's another piece that's in there related to getting to know your data, how to use data in working with transfer students. It's difficult to advocate for transfers and to really understand how to make those meaningful connections if you don't know much about your transfer population. That's a really great guide to help you along those lines as well. And in there also is an audit tool. So if you are a little bit more advanced in your career and you're wondering, like, how do we audit what we're doing around transfer in my department or at my institution, there's a great audit tool there for you all as well. If you're a faculty member, we've got a great guide there. Associated with the faculty guide is a nice one-pager on the barriers that transfer students face. And as somebody who wants to make meaningful connections, getting in touch with those barriers that are most likely on the minds of your transfer students would be really important. So again, that's the Knowledge Center at the NISTS website, nists.org.
Perfect. Appreciate that. Thank you, audience, for connecting and helping us launch day 3 of the connection. Next up, we are headed snap to school directly after this at 11 a.m. Eastern time with learning how to speak to Gen Z with Snapchat. Tag, comment, and share anything that you learned today at Carnegie HQ. Thanks for joining and enjoy the rest of your day.